Hi, my name is Aaron Saboter, and this is my final project on film theory and specialization in superheroes. So, my topic today is sort of the evolution of the media of superheroes, with emphasis on the change of the superhero dynamic in the early 2000s following 9/11. Now, I also spent some time researching different areas of economic turmoil in our country because following 9/11, we sort of spiraled into this Great Recession, they called, and there were a lot of movies that sort of predicted some of the things that were going on in our country, including things like the Patriot Act, the global economic recession, and also sort of how America tackled the war on terrorism. Now, the first era that I wanted to talk about actually has to do with the Great Depression and sort of the beginning of superhero comic books. This is really where you started seeing some of the mainstream comic books for Detective Comics and also Action Comics. So you were seeing the beginnings of Superman and Batman, Wonder Woman, and these are some mainstream characters that sort of continue on today as well as back then. Now, they didn't really have a lot of push in the movies because comics were sort of something that were purchased and thrown away. The idea is that people in movies were trying to be uplifted, and it was the same with the comics. People were trying to be lifted up out of this sort of great and global depression, taken out of their lives, which were kind of bleak at the time. Movies were a way of bringing people into a place where they could sort of escape that reality for a little while. So you saw a lot of comedies and sort of uplifting films, but not so much superheroes. Now, the next era that I wanted to talk about is the 1970s, which was sort of the evolution of the modern superhero. You were seeing the conflict of two different media, where in television and in mostly the cartoons, they were still seen as very much for children, whereas in the comic books, there was this evolution that not only could superheroes become a social commentary, they were mimicking the films of that time. So you were looking into the exploitation films, the grindhouse films, the slasher horror films, which were becoming a lot darker and gorier, and even some would say at the time borderlining pornography. But you had a lot of television shows about superheroes and cartoons that were akin to that of the Hanna-Barbera cartoons. And essentially they were lighthearted and didn't really express any sort of feeling of what superheroes could be. This was a representation of what parents wanted children to be watching. And I attribute this a lot to the rise of the comics code from the 40s on to the 70s. Whereas comics were changing, but media where children could be watching really was still kind of dumbed down. Now, this is going to lead into my final part of the presentation, which was the changing of superhero dynamics and more so the anti-heroes in the early 2000s following 9/11. The three movies I picked out that represented this time period were V for Vendetta, Batman Begins, and that of 300. Now, the reason I picked Batman Begins is it sort of represented the changing dynamic of the morally gray area of our country. You were seeing a lot of people that were trying to come to the same conclusion on things like the war on terror, the economic crisis, but essentially were coming at it from two different viewpoints. Really, this dynamic is best represented by Ra's al Ghul and Bruce Wayne as Batman. They essentially both want to save Gotham, but they're both going about it in completely different ways. And while neither of them are really a true hero, definitely Batman wanting to save Gotham instead of burn it to the ground was a bit of a better choice, I feel. Now, the reason I picked V for Vendetta for one of my movies is because there was a graying of ethics when it came to our country and our government at this time. Essentially, there were a lot of things that were coming into play, like the Patriot Act, which the government used a sort of fear-mongering to try and get people to believe that terrorists were all around us. The Patriot Act allowed the government to take you away from society and remove you from your friends and family without any method of contacting them or without any sort of due process. What was happening is if you were determined to be a terrorist, you would just disappear. And from there, much like V for Vendetta, you would be taken to a different government facility where you would be interrogated and possibly tortured to give up any possible information that you knew. This was similar to the rounding up and detaining of World War II Japanese citizens, only the major difference was that the citizens were told that it was for their own protection, whereas these people were being detained because of being potential terrorists. Lastly, I want to talk about the movie 300 and the similarities between that and the War on Terror. There were three fronts that were really being fought in the War on Terror. There was the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, which we were actually physically combating the terrorists. There was the internal sort of struggle that we had where the terrorists could possibly be sleeper agents here at home, and we also had that distrust of the government, similar to that of 300, where Leonidas consulted the A-Force and trying to get permission to fight this enemy like Xerxes and being turned away. Now, the real idea here is, who could we trust? Who was our enemy? Were they abroad? Were they here living among us? Or was it us that really was kind of being the enemy at the time? And I feel that's a good representation of just sort of how the world was. Now, if you have any additional questions, I would definitely recommend watching these three movies to get a better feel of just the evolution of heroes and the rise of the anti-hero. But I do thank you for your time and listening to my discussion, and have a good day.